Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the last lecture for Biology 106. This is exciting for all who are here. On the way in, I hope you picked up this piece of paper. This is the same exact thing that I sent you via announcement and email. This is the written assignment, the written question that will be on your final exam. It covers 20 different terms, and those 20 different terms all tell a beautiful story that we went over last time. So the 20 terms, including from aldosterone, angiotensin 1 and 2, ADH, ANP, renin, the juxtaglomerular complex, that whole story of regulation of urine flow and blood pressure and some of the hormones involved. So what you want to do is there's 20 terms there. Make sure as you use them, either in a well-developed paragraph or in a well-developed flow chart, make sure that it all makes sense, that there's connection words. You'll get a point for each term that you use properly, and then I'm putting 10 points on style, which basically says if you just have, the 20 words, that's fine, but if it doesn't flow or make really good sense, then you'll lose some points. So spend some time on this. This is 30 points. That's not an insignificant section. If you know the story, if you just practice the story in your head, talking through it, you'll be fine, and then you can write it down next Thursday during the exam. I'll be glad to entertain any questions related to that next Tuesday during our review. Okay, so take a look at that, play with that. I've given you the handout so you can scribble on it. Take a second one if you want to, just so you can kind of scribble it out and practice it, and it also was emailed to you. So we're in the urinary system. There's just a little bit left to go over. We're in the 2414 area, and this was just some different clinical scenarios. What happens when there's renal failure? What happens if someone has no kidney function and needs to go dialysis? So read over this. This is just very straightforward as far as the clinical modules and some of the different situations that one can be in if they have any sort of renal failure. This is showing you basically, the next page is showing you the concentrations. Now dialysis, remember that your filtering is all based upon concentration, right? Molecules are moving based upon concentration. So this is not an active process. And so it's important that the plasma versus dialysis fluid is going to pull the right components into the right place. So take a look at that and just get a sense of the direction in which molecules are moving from the dialysis and from the plasma itself. And here's just a little diagram of the process. Now, what I want to do is move into the next little section on urine storage. And most of this is mostly just anatomy. And we'll finish up with, in fact, I think I told you. Let me go back to the very first slide. Yeah, absolutely. 2415 and 2416 are just anatomy. So they're just a quick look over of the urethra and the ureters and the bladder. So that'll be very straightforward. So I want to jump over to the things that are a little bit new for us. So starting with 2415, 2416, this is just going to be, what the urinary tract is, including the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. This will be just completely anatomical review. Comparing the male and female urethra and the bladder, all very straightforward. The bladder has rugae in it, just like the stomach does, those folds that are found on the inside. And you know that inside the bladder, there's an imaginary triangle, the trigone, which is basically the two openings of the ureters and the entrance into the urethra. And in that triangular region acts like a funnel and helps to sort of push the urine down toward that internal sphincter. And that internal sphincter, right above the prostate in the male or leaving the bladder in the female, is going to be sensing that fullness, stretching of the full bladder, and will cause you to want to go to the restroom. The external sphincter, as we look at the male bladder here, the internal sphincter would be right in this area, right? Involuntary muscle, giving you the urge to go to the restroom with the filling of the bladder. And then the external sphincter is down here in what is also referred to as the urogenital diaphragm, right? That muscle layer that separates the inside from the outside world. And as the urine is leaving, it goes through the prostate. And what happens to many men as they get older? Right? The prostate begins to enlarge. And what are some of those symptoms? What's Uncle Joe complain about?
Can't pee.
Can't pee. Why? What's happening? If the prostate enlarges and by doing so kind of pinches off the urethra, that would certainly interrupt the flow, wouldn't it? Now, what else could happen? What are the other symptoms that Uncle Joe complains about? Got to go, but they can get there and nothing happens. So what's being pushed on? As that prostate enlarges, what could it be pushing on? The internal sphincter, right? Giving you the urge, hey, I've got to go, just like it's full, but there's nothing really there. Or what if it's pushing downward on the external sphincter? Then you could be a little bit incontinent, couldn't you? You could be opening up that sphincter uncontrollably. So got to go, nothing there, incomplete flow when you do flow, and sometimes a few accidents dribbling here and there because of that prostate pushing on these sphincters and disrupting the flow of urine. It makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, now, this just goes through the conduction of urine out of the body. If you looked inside the ureter, guess what you're going to find? What kind of epithelium? Same thing that's in the bladder, which is transitional, right? Transitional epithelium lining the bladder and lining the ureter. Why is there transitional? What's its function? What can it do? It can stretch. It can transition, right, from being very thinly arranged to being more jumbled up in a more of a stratified appearance. And this is found again lining the ureter and the bladder. The bladder has a mucosal layer, transitional epithelium. It has a muscularis, a muscle layer, and it has a submucosa. The muscle here is the detrusor muscle. What does detruse mean? This is the vocab term from 105. What does detruse mean? To force away, right? So as you contract on the bladder, on the muscle, it's going to push away the urine. So there's just a picture of that transitional epithelium. It just has a very distinctive look. We did look at it in 106, at the very beginning of the course. We looked at, it was on the list of new epithelia to recognize. And you may recall that one of the characteristics, it sort of has this domed look to it, has sort of a domed, pillowing look to it. And it can be sort of confused with pseudostratified columnar, because it kind of has that jumbled appearance. But all it can be is transitional on this test, right? There's no pseudostratified coming up on this lecture exam. In the urethra, also some of this. Now, what else would you find in the urethra, though? What kind of epithelium would you expect in the urethra? If you've ever had to give somebody a catheter, they're pretty thankful they have what kind of epithelium? Stratified, right? Protective. So just like we have stratified epithelium going into our oral cavity, into the anus or the vagina, same thing. Stratified squamous lining the urethra, right? So anything that's going toward the outside of the body typically is going to have a stratified epithelium. And this is why in the urine samples last week you saw epithelial cells, didn't you? You saw transitional cells. You can't tell the difference, but transitional epithelial cells could have been coming in through the urine from the bladder and from the ureter, and there would have been also stratified epithelia taking the travel or taking the journey with the urine out of the body. So urination, it is partially voluntary, right? We have that urge to go. We have a control over urination. This is referred to as the micturition reflex, and it's more than just voluntary, right? There's a reflexive nature to this. There are muscles that are involved and parts of your brainstem that are involved that while you initiate it, there's some underlying autonomic function going on. And we all know that the moment can come, right? No matter how hard you try, you're going to go to the bathroom. So there comes a point at which you don't have complete control over this. You could argue it's like breathing, right? We can choose to hold our breath and control the diaphragm only so long until the brain says, hey, breathe, breathe, dummy. And when the brainstem kicks in and the pH of the blood is starting to drop and those issues occur, and you're going to breathe no matter if you want to or not. Same thing is true here. There is a micturition reflex, and at some point the brainstem will kick in. So there is a central pathway that is controlled by the cerebral cortex, that is your voluntary nervous system, but there's also that involuntary reflexive pathway. So the local pathway, this is as the bladder is filling. There are stretch receptors in the bladder wall, and it's going to give you that urge along the internal sphincter. This signal is going to be carried to the sacral spinal cord, and here parasympathetic signals can speak to the detrusor muscle and start compressing the bladder. And this is going to allow the bladder to start pushing down. And there are interneurons that are also going to go up to the thalamus and project all the way up to the cerebral cortex. So right now, unless your bladder is really full, you're not aware of it, are you? So in other words, as it begins to fill, then signals are sent up to your thalamus and up to your cerebral cortex saying, hey, dummy, you might want to start thinking about looking for a restroom, right? There comes a time where you become aware of your bladder's fullness. Before that point, you weren't aware of it. At that point, you then have the control voluntarily over the external sphincter, right? So find the restroom and then go ahead and relax that sphincter. And now you would allow some pressure of the detrusor muscles leading to urination. So looking at sort of a flow chart of this, okay, this is coming from 2417 in your textbook, but basically as the bladder is filling, so the bladder is filling, the stretch receptors here are going to start sensing this, and there are stretch receptors in the wall of the bladder. This is going to send signals. These are afferent signals. They're coming up to the sacral region of the spinal cord. Those signals are then going to continue, and they're going to make you aware of the signal going up to the thalamus and then all the way up to the cortex of the brain. And then you have control over that. So the blue is what's involved with projecting up to the cerebral cortex, and the reddish pink is what's going on down here in the involuntary section. So the parasympathetic fibers that are going to help control and carry that signal to the bladder itself. So it makes total sense as you look at this flow chart. And what can go wrong in the urinary system? In addition to the kidneys being wrong, there can be some abnormal signals in the urine, and you've seen most of these in lab. So polyuria would be excessive urination. You may know what that could indicate if someone has polyuria. What common metabolic disease is associated with diabetes, right? Now, why would someone with diabetes have polyuria, excessive urination? Yeah, right? They've got more sugar in their blood and more sugar in their urine. And we know that solutes suck. So if you're peeing out more sugar, water's going to follow that solute, right? So it's the same thing with more sodium or more sugar. It doesn't matter what it is. If there's more solute in the urine, more water will follow. So one of the symptoms of diabetes is polyuria. There could also be an inflammation, right, of the glomeruli. And that makes sense, too, if there's more GFR, right? If there's more water being filtered across and it can't all be reabsorbed because for some reason the kidney has an infection, then of course you would also have increased urination. Oligouria, what does oligo mean? Remember oligodendrocytes? Oligodendrocytes were cells that wrapped around central nervous system axons and put out a few fingers, right, to myelinate. So oligo means few or deficient. So oligouria would be a deficient, not enough urine. We're talking less than 500 mils a day. Remember that 500 mils, back to day one, lecture one, 500 mils is your obligatory water loss. you've got to be putting out 500 mils a day in order to maintain your homeostasis and your overall metabolism. So less than 500, you've got an issue. You've got a reduced flow, oligouria. Now, no flow at all, right? If you have essentially zero flow, then you definitely have some kidney issues. So either oligo or anuria would represent significant kidney problems. The kidneys are basically shutting down, and you're looking at some sort of renal failure that's imminent, unless it's just a temporary thing. But typically, this would be a pretty serious situation. So now the person must go on dialysis, right? The kidneys are no longer working. They're no longer urinating on their own, and so they're going to have to go under artificial dialysis. There also can be increased urgency. We can't watch TV now without watching that little woman run around with a little bladder, right? Overactive bladder syndrome. So that is something that is real, that some more women than men deal with. And then there's also incontinence. And there's a whole area of nursing that deals just with incontinence. I have one of my son's soccer teammates' father is an OBGYN, and all he does all day is work with women at a women's clinic on incontinent issues. So this is a big issue. It's a rather common problem, and one that can be addressed in a number of different ways. But incontinence would simply be the inability to control the voluntary urination. So there could be some leakage involved, or simply the inability. So sometimes they'll have to do, well, there's a couple different options, from depends, right? Little leakage to depends to more significant capturing of that urine. And then there can also be not enough, right? So this idea of urinary retention. So in this situation, urination does not occur. And again, this is more going to be in males. Women are going to have the overactive urination more often. The guys are going to have that restriction, again, usually related to the prostate. And that begins around age 50. There can be benign prostate hyperplasia. It just kind of starts to increase in size. It's pretty harmless except for this symptom. But of course, if this begins, if it begins too much of a problem, then it can start affecting backflowing pressure on the kidneys and can be rather uncomfortable. So what's the problem? I mean, what are you going to sense? The kidneys are, of course, in the pubic region. So if there's any kind of bladder infection, where do people usually feel kidney damage or bladder infections? Where's the pain? It can be lower back, right? If you think back to a referred pain mechanism or a map, and if you look at where someone would sense problems with the kidney, it's usually that lumbar region. So you'll feel that pain, especially pyelonephritis would be an infection of the kidneys themselves, or if there's kidney stones, right? The calculi, that's the hard stuff that builds up in the kidney to make the stones. It's the same stuff the dental hygienist is taking off, right? The calculus and the tartar that builds up on your teeth. It's just hard stuff. And I always think math is, calculus is hard too. So the calculi are just the hard stuff. And dysuria also could be would be considered painful. We know dys means bad, painful. So dysuria would be a painful urination, which can be associated with an infection or enlarged prostate. So again, that pain would be usually in that lumbar region, lower pelvic region. Edema, right? If there is if you have proteinuria, what's proteinuria? Having protein in the urine, right? What's going to cause that? What can cause that? Again, why would protein be showing up in the urine? Probably from a history of high blood pressure, right, or damage to the kidneys. And again, those little fenestrations are getting blown open, and so as a result, proteins that wouldn't normally get filtered out are going to show up. Now, this protein in the urine, though, can also cause some swelling in other places as well. So it can even be around the eyes. There can be some issues that are associated kind of as a clinical sign of problems with the urinary system. And then if there is infection, if there's bacteria going up into the bladder and even up into the ureters, right? That can be associated with fever and pain. Should urine be sterile? When you hear urine is sterile, is it sterile? Certainly it's sterile at the time of filtration, right? So if your blood is sterile, right, there shouldn't be any bacteria in your blood. So what is being filtered out at the glomerulus should be sterile, lacking of bacteria. And through the ureter, essentially, sterile, to the bladder. Now, if there's any sort of infection that has traveled up the urethra into the bladder, then of course the urine would not be sterile. And by the time it leaves the body, you certainly can't expect anything outside of your body to be sterile. So to say it's sterile is kind of a misnomer. It's sterile within your body as long as there's no infection along the way. But of course, once it's released from the urethra, there's going to be lots of bacteria on the skin surface along the urethra. So the out product would not necessarily be sterile. And that does bring us to the end of the urinary system. Look back. Are there any questions at all related to our discussions thus far that I can clarify? We've had about 2 lectures plus a little bit more on the urinary system. It's a big part, obviously, of our next exam. The reproductive systems, male and female, are important. You don't want to forget about those when you're studying, but honestly, the urinary system will be probably, I'd say, a good 65, 2/3 of the exam, because that's where we spent most of our time. Even the next conversation we're going to have, the rest of this conversation, is also related to the kidneys. So really, the urinary system and the acid balance, all this is coming back to the urinary system. So I might even tip the scale. Yeah, I'd say at least 2/3 of the exam would be urinary acid base, with a little bit on male and a little bit on female reproductive. I haven't put the exam together, so now that I've said that, I'll keep that in mind. Okay. Plus that 30-point question, the written question. So that'll be the only written portion of the exam. Questions? Caitlin, any questions? Austin? Katie? Nothing? Megan? Nada? Samson? It's like romper room. Roxana? Nothing? Pretty straightforward, right? Yes. Overwhelming to some. Yes, right? But nothing you guys can't handle. You guys are great students. You've been working really hard this semester. Nobody said it was going to be easy, right? Okay, so let's take a look at the last little bit of information. I think I lost it. And this comes from the last little bit of Chapter 25. Now, Chapter 25 is where we started our semester together. And back in the first 2 sections, or the first sections of Chapter 25, is where we talked about fluid in the body, right? Urination, how the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus picked up the amount of solute that's in your CSF and in your blood, and how ADH was involved with regulating your fluid levels. And then we moved into that conversation long ago about where sodium and potassium are normally found. We know sodium's usually where? More outside, right, in the extracellular fluid, and potassium's always found on the inside. And chlorine is found where? Wherever sodium is, right? Chlorine and sodium always go together, so the chlorine's found on the outside. So we've talked about that information a while back. At the end of this chapter is where we're going to pick up, and that is with 25.6. So we've got just about 4 little pages, if you will, of Chapter 25 to take a look at. And this also comes back to fluid regulation, but not so much about electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, but instead now looking at acid-base. We know, we appreciate that the kidneys are doing a very important job in filtering our blood. And the kidneys, you can think of one of their major jobs is to get rid of acid. What's the process by which the kidneys are getting rid of acid? What was the name for that process? Not reabsorption, but secretion. Remember secretion, the opposite? I told you that there were two ions that were being secreted. What were the two that I told you to think about? H plus and K plus, right? So we've got hydrogen and potassium, both of which are being secreted. Our conversation here is going to be mostly about hydrogen. What two systems are primarily getting rid of the acids out of your body? Respiratory and urinary, absolutely, right? The urinary system is getting rid of acids that are dissolved in our plasma that are being filtered out by the glomerulus and in the kidney. And the respiratory system is taking care of the CO2, which, remember that CO2 in our blood makes it acidic. So we're going to get rid of CO2 with our lungs. We're going to get rid of other acids through our urine. And these two systems are working together. What we're going to see today is that when the kidneys are having trouble, the lungs will try to compensate. When the lungs are having trouble keeping up with the CO2, the kidneys will try to compensate. So these two systems are working, backing up each other when the pH of our blood goes up or down. So that's kind of where we're going to be focusing our attention. You're going to have to go back and think a little bit about respiratory, not hugely, but a little bit, as we go through this conversation. So where are these acids coming from? Again, these acids are coming from your metabolism, right? So things like just the breakdown of protein, the breakdown of amino acids, the breakdown or the production of nucleic acids, all of that produces uric acid and other acids which must be gotten rid of. So that is the challenge that the body must meet in meeting, quote, our acid-base hemostasis. Lactic acid is also being built up when we exercise, right? We've got our muscles working. We've talked about lactic acid a little bit in the past. All that has to be gotten rid of. Now, the respiratory system will be eliminating, like I said, CO2. The kidneys will be excreting H+. The skin gets rid of a little bit, not much, right? A little bit of sweat. There's a little bit that could be released. There could be some, well, there's some acid released in your digestive system too, isn't there? How does that work? Right? The stomach, right, is rather acidic. And that acid is then spit into the duodenum along with your digestive products, isn't it? And then the pancreas puts out some bicarbonate and some other buffers that help to break down that acid. So actually, we're also defecating a fair amount of acid as well. So it's not just the respiratory and not just the urinary system that are dealing with acids, but they're the biggest players. But a little bit from digestive, a little bit from the integumentary. Okay. So we're getting rid of H+. H+ always means acid. You're getting rid of it through the CO2, through the kidneys, and we are basically buffering some of that as well. We need some H+. We need to have acid to make hydrochloric acid in our gut, right? We can't be without acid. We need to have some because our digestive system needs to have acid to break down our food products. So sometimes we have to keep hold of that acid and buffer it, which basically means what? What's a buffer do? If you had bicarbonate, well, some of you drank bicarbonate last week, right? What happened? Who drank bicarbonate? We talked about this last time? Caitlin, remember? As much as you could, yeah. Right? I remember that now. There was a breakdown in the experiment. But if you drink bicarb, right, you're giving your body an antacid, basically. And so what should have happened over time? Your pH should have come up, right? You should have seen an increase in your pH of your urine. So sometimes we need to buffer. So a buffer is a molecule that does what? Helps to maintain, stop the pH from jumping around too much. So taking a look at this picture, we see that in order for the blood to keep that 7.4 average blood pH, 7.35 to 7.45 is considered within a normal range, that we've got the kidneys getting rid of acid, right? We've got the respiratory system blowing off CO2. That represents little alveolus in that little looks like a little round bottom flask. And then on the left-hand side, we have, of course, where is this acid coming from? A reminder, every cell in your body is constantly making acid as part of its metabolism. So we've got to get rid of it. That story hopefully makes very good sense. So what kinds of acids do we have? Well, there's what we call fixed acids. These are the ones that remain in fluid. These are the ones that the kidneys are essentially working on. Examples would be sulfuric acid. Example would be sulfuric acid, phosphoric acid, acids you may have heard about in a chemistry lab that are also found in our body. They're generated through the catabolism. What's catabolism again? Catabolism is the breakdown of your amino acids, your phospholipids, and nucleic acids. So as the body is doing its normal metabolism, you are forming some of these fixed acids. They don't leave solution, aka they stay dissolved in your blood. Versus there are organic acids. Organic acids would be also those that we create as byproducts like lactic acid, some of the ketones. You saw ketones show up in the lab, didn't you, last week? And if there were high ketones in one's urine, we would say you have ketonuria. And it'd be a sign of what? If you had high ketones, Samson? Yeah, diabetes for sure. And if you saw it along with glucoseuria, with glucose, that's a pretty definitive sign that if you have both high sugar and ketones in your blood, in your urine, that you have diabetes. Now, typically those organic acids they're not going to accumulate. In a person with normal metabolism, they're not going to accumulate. But in diabetic, they can accumulate and lead to ketoacidosis, lead to a decreasing of the pH of the blood. And then there are the volatile acids. And if somebody's volatile, what does it mean? What does the word volatile mean to you? Austin? Volatile? Maybe they can blow up, right? Kind of a volatile person, with a volatile personality. Anyway, these are the acids that can leave through the atmosphere. So these are the acids that can be blown off by the lungs. Right? If something is volatile, it can kind of come out of solution and become a gas as well. So this is the carbonic acid, and carbonic acid, where have you seen that before? Right? CO2 plus water makes carbonic acid. So you've seen that before, and that was done in the red blood cells. So that carbonic acid then we can get rid of, right? We get rid of that one in part through CO2. So again, there's 3 groups of acids, and our body is constantly making these, and we must get rid of them. The normal pH of your extracellular fluid, 735 to 745. It's the same as what? Plasma. Do you agree that plasma and extracellular fluid is pretty much the same stuff? It's the same chemical range. We don't want to get it outside of that range. If there are changes in the hydrogen concentration, then there can be problems with phospholipids, with membrane integrity. There can be problems with structure of your proteins. Do you remember what happens to proteins if the pH changes? What's the word we use for proteins when the pH drops especially? Remember the term denature? So if a protein is put into a more acidic environment, it will start to denature, and that is it'll start to unravel. And once that denaturing occurs, proteins don't snap back into their normal shape. So remember, the shape of a protein is very important for its job. So if you start changing the structure of proteins, then you're also going to start changing the ability of enzymes to do their work. So this can become very, very important, very, very critical. And there are enzymes that are very sensitive to pH changes, which can have drastic effects in the nervous system and in the cardiovascular system. So as the pH drops or goes up, people can become comatose, right, go into seizures. The central nervous system is very, very upset by pH changes. Again, below 6.8 or above 7.7, you're pretty much dead very soon if the body cannot fix that. So that means that both the lungs and the kidneys have stopped doing their job and are unable to keep up with the production of acids. So just take a look at this table again. We got to keep the pH the same. Remember the term neutral? This is just a reminder of pH. Neutral is pH what? 7, right? Anything above 7 is considered basic or alkaline. Things below 7 are considered acidic. An acid is something that releases hydrogen ions. So the more hydrogen ion there is around, the lower the pH, the more acidic something is. The less hydrogen around, the more alkaline or basic something can be. And a salt is something that does not give off a hydrogen. And so like something like sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is a salt. And a buffer is a substance that tends to change or opposes the change of the pH. Just some definitions. Now, if your blood, and in essence also your plasma pH, if it goes below 7.35, you are more acidic than you should be. We're going to say that you are acidotic or that you have acidemia. Below 7, like I said, is considered very dangerous. What's going to happen? A low pH, again, the central nervous system begins to deteriorate, some seizures, some coma. Cardiac contractions will grow weaker and less regular. Vasodilation will also occur in a low pH, so that there's a peripheral vasodilation that occurs, and that's going to open up all the vessels and drop the blood pressure. So all of this is very, very critical. Alkalosis would be a pH above 7.45. Again, we get two basic, alkalemia or alkalosis of the blood, and this also can be very dangerous, but nowhere near as common, right? Because what's the body always making? Acids. It's very unlikely that your blood pH would rise. It can happen, and I won't get into that too much, but it's mostly the issue of acidosis. That's going to be 99.9% of the time you're dealing with the pH dropping. So just a reminder of the pH scale. We need to know this really well. 7.4, again, being the middle. So that means that blood is slightly alkaline, isn't it? Right? Blood is slightly over 7, so it's not neutral. It's a little bit alkaline. And again, we can't live too far outside of that normal range. So we've been alluding to this, right? There is CO2 that is being carried through the plasma. We talked about that in the last test or so. You know that there's a certain amount of CO2 that is then going to be blown off. And remember that CO2, when it combines with water, forms that carbonic acid. We saw that. What kind of acid did we call this, carbonic acid? Was it fixed, organic, or volatile? Volatile, right? That was the kind of acid that can be converted back to something that's gaseous in CO2. And this can jump back and forth. So carbonic acid and CO2 and water can go back and forth. But if you rearrange that chemical equation, you can also get out of it bicarbonate. And bicarbonate will help buffer this a little bit. There's an inverse relationship between PCO2 and your pH. And we know this. As your PCO2, the pressure of CO2 increases, that means there's more CO2, right? And with more CO2, pH goes down, right? You're more acidic. If there's less PCO2, then that would cause an increase in pH. So there's a balance, right? And this is just showing you that sort of a way of thinking about it. I want you to appreciate this equation, though, a little bit more. So water plus CO2 can combine to make carbonic acid. We've said that before. But then that carbonic acid can break down or dissociate into hydrogen and bicarb, HCO3 minus, bicarbonate ion. And as you see, what happens? What do we know? We know that more hydrogen does what? Drops the pH. Okay, so this is where CO2 becomes a problem. this is the chemistry of why CO2 becomes a problem. So as CO2 rises in your blood, you get more of this carbonic acid, right? And then that carbonic acid can dissociate and make more of this hydrogen. More hydrogen makes things more acidic. Likewise, other way, right? It's a reversible reaction. That hydrogen can be taken away, right, to make carbonic acid and then to create more CO2. And as you're blowing off CO2, what's happening to your pH? It's going back up, isn't it? So just kind of look at this little teeter-totter, make sure you can appreciate this. The questions that I'll ask about this are not that difficult if you can sort of remember this little balancing act, right? More CO2, lower pH. So a strong acid is one that when you put it into water, easily dissociates, breaks down, and gives you H+, right? The more H+ there is, the more acidic something is. So a weak acid is one that doesn't release as much H+. So some acids are weak acids because they don't break down quite as easily and change the pH. Strong acids would strongly change the pH, make it more acidic. Now, oftentimes, if we take a substance like, a weak acid, and we call it HY, right, HY, H is the, right, H, just like HCl. No, it's not really a weak acid, but hydrochloric acid, right? HCl. So an acid could be HY. Here, H is just the hydrogen ion, Y is the negatively charged anion. And typically, these molecules will be in equilibrium. If you add more H+ ions, you'll disrupt this equilibrium, and removing will also disrupt this equilibrium. It's really no different than what I showed you before, but your body is always trying to balance these two molecules. So your body is always pushing these hydrogens around, again, trying to maintain your pH of your blood, pH of your plasma, pH of your extracellular fluids, and your kidneys are helping to control this. So we need to buffer. We can't have these acids affecting your body. We have to be able to bind up this extra hydrogen. So that's what buffers do. And there's three major buffer systems in your blood and in your tissues. And what it's going to do is not steal the body of the hydrogen, but basically buffer it, hide it, combine it in a different way so that it's not negatively affecting the pH. So there are phosphate buffers. And this is going to buffer the intracellular fluid. So you have a lot of phosphates in your cells. You also have a lot of phosphates in your urine. There's also proteins that are going to buffer, and then there is a carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. That's what I was kind of showing you before, where carbonic acid can move back and forth to bicarbonate and try to hide some of that acid from the body. Let's just take a look at this. So again, we have these buffering systems. In the intracellular fluid, there's the phosphate buffer system. There's also some of the protein buffer system. And even hemoglobin, right, can be a buffer in red blood cells. There's amino acids that act as buffers. There are plasma protein buffers. Lots of proteins can act as buffers. And then in the extracellular fluid, right, think plasma, that's where we have the bicarbonate and the carbonic acid buffering system in play. So most of these protein buffer systems are going to help regulate the pH of your extracellular fluid and the intracellular. You see them on both sides. And they're going to bind up any excess hydrogen. Right? That's what these things are doing. All these buffering systems are going to grab that hydrogen, Because what does hydrogen do? Hydrogen by itself can affect the pH very strongly. So we take the hydrogen out of solution, and we can do that by that hydrogen attaching to some groups. I won't get us into the chemistry of all this, but there are some molecules here that can receive a hydrogen. And when those hydrogen molecules are received, it's hiding it, right? It no longer can affect the pH as strongly as it could. So we see that amino acids can act as buffers. Okay, I'm not going to get into the functional groups. If you know there's some chemistry, that's fine, but I'm not going to require that you know the amino and the carboxy groups. For those who have had a little chemistry, you can appreciate that this is an amino acid. That amino acid has a little negative charge on it, and that negative charge can receive one of these hydrogens and make OH. When that OH group exists, that hydrogen has been taken away from the solution, and now it won't affect the pH as much. It's also possible for this little NH2 group here to grab another hydrogen and become an NH3 group. Again, what you're doing is you're pulling that hydrogen out of solution, buffering it, keeping it from affecting the pH. So lots of proteins act as buffers. Hemoglobin also can do this. It's the only buffer system that has an immediate effect, and it's, of course, hemoglobin is only found in red blood cells. And so that's a limited, of course, you have billions of red blood cells, but this is important because what cells are carrying some CO2 in your body? Right? Some red blood cells are carrying CO2 on hemoglobin. So it's important that hemoglobin also can help grab some of this extra hydrogen, and CO2 can be converted to carbonic acid. Again, that's going to help grab it away from the body and minimize the effect. Now, the nice thing about this system, you know, is that now that carbonic acid can be reversed and CO2 can be dropped off in the lungs for release in the alveoli. So we've been through this story. We know that CO2 comes in, is carried on the red blood cells, that carbonic acid is formed, that then can form the bicarb, and that hydrogen, look at it, it's sticking on, it looks like this, HBH. Right? So what that's showing is that hemoglobin has grabbed that hydrogen, right, and taken it away from solution. And then when we get back to the alveoli, that hydrogen that was stuck on the hemoglobin, what is it doing? Jumping back on bicarb, making carbonic acid, and then blowing out CO2. So you can see how the hydrogens are shifted around, protected from the pH shifting of the body as a buffer. And then finally, this whole carbonic acid bicarbonate system, again, very, very important, and really is hugely important with the respiratory system, such that you always have a bicarbonate reserve in the fluid. So there's always some bicarb sitting around, and bicarb is the same stuff if you have a hot tub or a pool that you throw into your tub. Right? You throw it into the pool, helps to buffer the pH, keep the pH from changing. So it's really the same chemistry in a hot tub or a pool as it is in your body. So I do need you to understand this, okay? I need you to appreciate this. It's the same story over and over in a way, though. So if there's extra H, right, there's extra H being made, extra acid being made by your cells, it can be converted, right? It can jump on with bicarb. There's always bicarb floating around in your blood. And that bicarb can combine with hydrogen to make what? Carbonic acid. That carbonic acid can travel through your blood and head off to the lungs. That the carbonic acid can be broken back into its components of CO2 and water. The CO2 is blown off, the water is used in other places. Okay. So it's really the same thing that just happened in red blood cells, isn't it? So this is just an important little chemical equation. You've seen it 5 or 6 times now showing up. Okay, so what can go wrong here? If there's too much acid being produced and you're becoming acidotic, okay? Again, we're going to try to work against these, but if for some reason you are producing or you're losing excessive amounts of acid, either way, if you've got a lot of diarrhea and you're vomiting a lot, what could happen to your pH? What do you think? What could happen with a lot of diarrhea, a lot of vomiting? What are you getting rid of very quickly? Acid, right? So if you're getting rid of a lot of acid, what could happen to your pH? It could go up, right? Now, you're not going to usually be vomiting and diarrhea so long, but it's possible, isn't it? Right? So we see that these metabolic disorders could go either way. I told you, usually we're dealing with becoming more acidic, but it is possible to become more basic. So there can be a respiratory disorder. Let me go back. This is the metabolic disorder. We're going to talk about this in a moment. A metabolic disorder is the body is making too much or not enough acids. And again, your body is trying to protect against these disorders, right? The buffering systems are trying desperately not to let these metabolic shifts affect your overall homeostasis. It's also possible, though, for your respiratory system to contribute. So if there's not enough CO2 being generated or not enough CO2 being eliminated, this also can lead to problems. Here's the deal. In the respiratory system, if there's an acid-base disorder in CO2, that carbonic acid bicarbonate system is not going to help. Okay, that bicarb system is really more effective with the kidneys and dealing with the plasma. So here, if you have, we don't have the buffering capacity here, so now if there's a respiratory acid imbalance, the lungs themselves will try to respond. So what would happen? Too much CO2? What would you do? What would your lungs do? Too much acid. What would they do? What would your lungs do? Yeah, you want to get rid of that CO2, right? So what are you going to do to blow it off? You want to get more oxygen in and you want to get that CO2 off. So how are you going to breathe? More often and more deeply, right? You're going to try to get more oxygen in. You're going to try to get that CO2 off. And so your rate of respiration and the depth of your respiration will change. How hard you're breathing and how often you're breathing. So let's put this all into 4 different categories. I'm going to have metabolic acidosis. I'm going to have metabolic alkalosis. I'm going to have respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. And these will be the 4 different situations that we're going to deal with. Let's start off with metabolic acidosis. All this means, basically, is that your body has produced more acid than it can handle. Right? And when I think about metabolic acidosis, I think first about the kidneys. The kidneys are not keeping up with the acid levels. Now, let's look at the kidneys first. Yes, the kidneys are going to try to secrete more hydrogen into the urine. The pH of the urine will go down, no doubt about it. They're going to try to remove that acid. They're going to try to reabsorb more bicarb to try to deal with this buffering problem. The lungs will also try to kick in. Again, if you've got too much acid, we just said, what are the lungs going to do? What are they going to attempt to do? Get rid of more CO2, get rid of more acid, so the rate of respiration will change. You'll breathe more quickly, and that will convert more of that carbonic acid to water and get rid of that CO2. So let's just get through these 4 categories. Looking at this picture, okay, I like these flow charts. What's happening? Too much acid, metabolically. Body's making too much acid. So what's that acid doing? That acid has available to it that carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system that is in your plasma. And as a result, as we saw earlier, it's going to drive more CO2 to the lungs, and it's going to be able to take that hydrogen out by combining it with bicarb because you have that bicarb reserve, and it's going to allow you now to get rid of some of this through your kidneys. So you're going to be increasing your secretion of hydrogen, and you're going to blow off more CO2. And what should those 2 things do? Restore that imbalance, right? If you've got too much acid in your body temporarily, your kidneys send out more acid, your lungs blow off more CO2, and hopefully by doing so in the short term, you'll return everything back to homeostasis, back to normal. How are the kidneys going to do this? Well, they're going to secrete more, right? They're going to take more hydrogen out. So here's you look at all the hydrogen that's being formed here. Oops, sorry. So as you look at, this is the tubular fluid. Here's your tubular fluid, and look at all the hydrogen that's being put out into the tube, right? And again, it's coming from the body. So when you see hydrogen being brought into the tubule, that's secretion, isn't it? So we're going to increase the amount of hydrogen being formed. Look what's going into the body. Remember there's lots of bicarb over here. So there's your bicarb, lots of bicarb. There's bicarb inside the cells. And you also see that CO2 is being brought, if you will, the acid is being brought over into the cell itself. So this is just the kidney dealing with this extra, getting rid of this extra acid. You already know this story. You've seen this before. Now, what about metabolic alkalosis? This is when, for some reason, you have removed too much hydrogen quickly, or too much acid quickly from your body. I've already alluded to how this can happen. How would you quickly lose a lot of acid from your body? Vomiting, diarrhea, right? Those could be definitely situations where this could happen. What's the kidney going to do in response to that? It's going to reduce the amount of hydrogen that it's going to secrete and release in the pH, in the urine. So what's going to happen to your urine pH? It's going to go up, isn't it? Right? It's going to become a little bit higher. The cells will not be reclaiming the bicarb, and as a result, right, you're going to be releasing more acid, trying to make up for this alkalosis. Again, you're trying now to bring the pH back down. What's the body going to do in response to a metabolic alkalosis? What are the lungs going to do, folks? Don't make this hard. Please don't make this hard. I know it's a lot of new terms, but don't make this hard. It makes sense. What are the lungs going to do? When there was more acid, they were going to breathe faster, right? If there's more base, now they're going to do what? Respiratory control. You're going to decrease the respiratory rate, right? And that's going to, if you're blowing off less CO2, what's going to happen to your CO2 levels in your blood? They're going to go up, right? So you're blowing off less, CO2 levels will rise in your blood, right? If you have more CO2 in your blood, you would convert more of that CO2 over to that carbonic acid form, wouldn't you? Because you got more of it. You've got more CO2 floating around. What will the kidneys do in this response? They're going to try to hold on to acid too, aren't they? So the kidneys are going to try not to release hydrogen, so they're going to convert more of that hydrogen. They're going to excrete more bicarb, that is, not release as much hydrogen. So they're going to conserve the hydrogen. They're going to conserve the hydrogen. Hydrogen and bicarb are always going in opposite directions. So if you're going to release hydrogen, you're going to conserve bicarb. If you're going to hold on to hydrogen, you're going to release bicarb. It's always going to be a yin-yang situation. So again, let's take a look at these flow charts, which I think are really, really helpful. You've got too much hydrogen being released from the body. You want to restore that hydrogen levels. So what are we going to do? We're going to take CO2, rather than blowing off CO2, we're going to restrict the amount of CO2 we're blowing off. We're going to retain it. And we're also going to we're going to get rid of bicarb. And as a result, right, we're going to secrete less hydrogen, or actually secrete more bicarb. That's one thing we didn't measure upstairs. The chem strip doesn't measure bicarb directly, but it's kind of inversely related to pH. So if the pH was going down, bicarb would be going up. And what is the kidney going to do? Again, rather than getting rid of hydrogen, right, it's going to retain, the body is going to retain hydrogen. We want to hold on to it. We're going to be retaining hydrogen, and we're going to get rid of bicarb. So bicarb will be released in an alkalosis, hydrogen would be released, and an acidosis. So those are called metabolic disorders. Typically, the body is overproducing or underproducing acid, or in the case of vomiting, it's something has occurred, usually short term, where the body is losing too much acid quickly. We can also look at respiratory acid-based disorders. This is where the kidneys may be just fine, but now the lungs are not responding or are having trouble keeping up with their job. So this would be an imbalance in the rate of how much CO2 is being generated. Okay, so something's not right, and you're either keeping too much CO2 or you're blowing off too much CO2. And again, remember that the respiratory system cannot have this imbalance corrected by that carbonic acid and that excessive bicarb that we just saw. In those pictures we just looked at, there was always this little bicarb reserve, right? So there's always this bicarb reserve that could assist the kidneys in these metabolic disorders. That's not here anymore when we're dealing with just with the respiratory system. So now we'll have respiratory acidosis. Well, you tell me. The respiratory part of this tells us that it's primarily the lungs trouble here. Acidosis tells us that the blood is becoming more acidic. Tell me, please, what would be going on here? If the pH is dropping and the lungs are responsible, what's happening? If you're becoming more acidic, what is your body accumulating? CO2, right? Not the metabolic acids, but now it's accumulating the volatile acid, CO2. That CO2 is going to be converted to more of the carbonic acid. But basically, how much CO2 you're making is exceeding the rate that it's being removed. As a result, and in this situation, the lungs are not able to take care of it by themselves. So the underlying problem cannot be corrected without an increase in the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is going to do its best to fix this by what's going to happen to the respiratory rate. If you're accumulating CO2, what would the lungs try to do? Yeah, get rid of that CO2, right? Get more oxygen in and get more CO2 off. Again, respiratory rate would increase. Okay, but it's not enough. Okay, it's not enough. So again, in this situation, what we see is that there's not enough. You see a dotted line. There's not enough CO2 being blown off. There's too much CO2 being accumulated in the body. That CO2 is combining with water, as you know it does, and forms that carbonic acid. That carbonic acid then breaks down, and again, what's happening is we're getting too much hydrogen. And that hydrogen now is going to start causing problems with our acidosis. So the respiratory rate will increase. The amount of hydrogen secreted by the kidneys will attempt to be increased. Okay, everything's going to respond to this disturbance in the homeostasis. So let's take a look at this now. What's going to happen? So there's been a disturbance, and as a result of this disturbance, there's an increase in PCO2. Hypoventilation. What does that word mean there, hypoventilation? What does the term ventilation mean in this? Sometimes ventilation means a couple different things in our head, doesn't it? What does this ventilation term mean here? Hypoventilation means what? That we haven't been exchanging gases at the proper rate, right? There hasn't been enough of that exchange. As a result, what's accumulating? Right? CO2 is increasing. As CO2 increases, what happens to our blood pH? It goes down. It's the same story over and over, guys. If you know this, if you understand this little story, you can piece together any question I ask you. So CO2 is going up, pH is going down. So what's going to happen? The lungs are going to try to compensate for this. They're going to increase the chemoreceptors, right, are sensing a decrease in pH. The kidneys are going to try to get rid of more of that hydrogen. As a result, the body will try to decrease the amount of CO2 and return the levels back to normal. I'm trying to make it as simple and straightforward as I can. There can also be respiratory alkalosis. What's happening in this situation? For some reason, there's not hypoventilation, there is instead hyperventilation. Have you seen someone hyperventilating before? Okay. And what are they telling you? They're breathing really, really fast, and they feel like they're going to black out, right? So what do you have these folks do? Breathe into a bag. What kind of bag? Paper bag, right? What are you doing? Well, this is a respiratory alkalosis. So it's the opposite of acidosis. So what does that tell us? The body is getting rid of too much CO2, right? They're breathing so quickly that CO2 is being blown off faster than it's being produced. You have less acid, which is going to cause your pH to go up. So we have these individuals breathe into a paper bag. What are they basically doing? They're breathing back that same CO2. So rather than blowing off CO2 too much, they're breathing in that same air over and over, back and forth. So now they're getting that CO2 returned to them, aren't they? They're not getting fresh oxygen, but instead they're getting that spent air that they're blowing off that has CO2. So they're bringing in more CO2 to replace it. Now, this is not something that's going to happen very, very commonly, but it can be a person who's very anxious and begins to hyperventilate. They can feel very faint, like I said. Again, this is going to shift that whole system to the left. I'll show that to you in a moment. And the pH is going to go up. So now, too much, big line, CO2 is being blown off. CO2 is being pulled over to the lungs faster than it is being formed. So the hydrogen levels, right, are being lost, and that is going to lead to alkalosis. So what would the lungs try to do, right? What do you want to try to do? In a respiratory alkalosis situation, you want to try to decrease their respiratory rate. The kidneys would also decrease the amount of acid that is being secreted. It would increase their secretion of bicarb. Remember, that's always opposite. Okay? Those are always opposite, the hydrogen and the bicarb. So taking a look at this kind of scenario, again, acid base has been imbalanced. Here, there's a hyperventilation causing a decrease in the pCO2, the amount of CO2 that's dissolved in the blood. As a result, right, the pH is going to be increasing in the blood. What's going to happen? Respiratory compensation by slowing down the breathing rate. Those chemoreceptors are going to get involved, and they're going to send an autonomic system telling you to slow down your breathing if possible. The kidneys are going to start putting out more hydrogen to get rid of this. And again, between the two systems, they're going to hopefully restore homeostasis. These are always happening, right? There's always these little acute, brief moments where your lungs and your kidneys are stepping in. This is all happening in the background autonomically. We don't think about it. This is a beautiful system where these two very important systems work seamlessly. It's not until there's a chronic issue, right, that this really can be a problem. So when either the chemoreceptors or when the lungs are no longer functioning through an emphysema situation or fibrotic situation, or where the kidneys are failing, where these two systems can't fully talk to each other, that we really start having problems. And then you start getting acidosis, right? So either the lungs aren't working or the kidneys aren't working. Now, if the kidneys aren't working, we can usually do, dialysis. The lungs aren't working, we do a respirator to a point, right? To a point, and try to maintain homeostasis as well as possible. That's the goal, isn't it? Keep that person going. So those are the 4 situations I want you to know about. I won't have a short answer for these, but you should be able to basically go to those flowcharts and ask yourself what's going to happen if there's an alkalotic or an acidotic change, and what would the lungs do and what would the kidneys do in response to those challenges. That's really the take-home lesson from this last part. It's still related to the kidneys, and it does pull over some information from the lungs that I'm sure you have not forgotten since the last exam. Questions for me? Remember, we will have a review session next Tuesday. Before I see you, however, what is due on mastering? Let me just be very clear. I don't want any of those sorrowful emails, oh, I didn't know. They're always due X time or Y time, right? So let's take a look. But before you leave, let's just take a look at the calendar. We'll do this together. So what have I done for you? Okay, so here we are today. And there are some group 24, some of those dynamic study modules. Those are those double-click, single-click assignments. People seem to like those. I've got some on chapter 24. What's chapter 24? Urinary, right? So we've been through that. You should be able to go through that with great confidence. And there's also one on acid base. So what we just talked about. So they're all there. You could do those as soon as you want to. They usually take about 20, 25 minutes to do. Then there's also the extra credit quiz. So if you want a few extra points, make sure you do that extra credit quiz. That one's on development. That one's due no later than Sunday at midnight. And then there's homework assignments. 24 is the urinary system. I put that one earliest because we completely talked about that together. And then there's also a quiz on 25, which is the acid base that we just talked about, and reproductive, 26. And I left that a little longer because I know some of you may not have had a chance to listen to the lectures and get caught up on that. You want to have these assignments. Let me remind myself.
Do you think there is a quiz for base?
It's part of the urinary.
Oh,
Okay, so that's part of the urinary, Roxana. So if we go into this, right here. So I've got these due. Okay, these homework assignments, folks, are due at class time. And I did that purposefully. So that when you come to class time, they're not due at midnight, right? They're not due at midnight, they're due at class time. So that's going to force you, hopefully, gently nudge you, to have those homework assignments done before we have the review. Because the review will make a whole lot more sense to you and be more effective if you have interacted with the material. So I'm forcing you to do those homeworks. The only thing that would be due after the review would be the 2 quizzes. They're not due until midnight of Wednesday night. The exam is Thursday. If you have the ability between now and next Tuesday to do the quizzes, I think it's a toss-up, isn't it? Doing the quiz before the review or doing the quiz, if you do it before the review, then you'll be really tuned in when you come to the review session. If you wait for the quizzes till after the review, there may be a couple things that click that haven't clicked yet. So I'll let you make the choice on the quizzes. Do you want to attempt them? Now, you could be in there working on them without submitting them, right? So just because they're not due till Wednesday, you could certainly start working on them and then even bring some of those questions with you to class on Tuesday. What about this? Help me understand this. So I really want this review session to be interactive. It's not my lecturing at you. It's my answering questions and helping guide you. By then I have the test written and I can guide you through that. So I really hope that you'll attend next Tuesday evening. I may or may not record that. It just depends on how I'm feeling. Okay? So I really would encourage everyone who's listening to show up for that review face-to-face and take advantage of that, because I'm not going to promise that I'm going to record that, and then our test will be Thursday at 4:30. Any questions? Logistics? Okay, here we are, guys. 1 minute to go. We finished this semester. It's been a good one. I hope you can look back and smile, at least after the exams, right? Then we'll smile.